Hello, and welcome to Let's Just Talk. I'm your host, Hammi. Today, we are joined by Professor Blanding to discuss race and policing and analyze whether the police are above the law. Dr. Blanding has taught political science, public policy, and law at American University, McDaniel College, and now at Brown University. He also worked at JL, a nonpartisan agency that conducts research on federal policies and programs on behalf of the United States Congress. Dr. Blanding, welcome to Let's Just Talk.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
To begin, we're going to give you 3 to 5 minutes to offer your thoughts on this issue of race and policing in the United States.
Yeah. So let me first start up by saying I love the way you frame that question, are cops above the law? I think it's a great question. It's the kind of question that people are asking themselves and have been asking themselves for a long time, right? With the murders of Tyree Nichols most recently, but the long line historically of police misconduct or disproportionate discipline or treatment of people of color and generally in black men in particular, it's a question that's worth asking.
Right.
But I would suggest that it may not be quite the right question in this moment. If you had to answer simply, are cops above the law, the answer is arguably yes. And yes in 2 respects. One, in the sense of the design of police and their authorities and powers. And I'm referring to something called qualified immunity, where police, and not just police, but many other government officials enjoy a level of immunity from the kinds of discipline that you or I as lay citizens would expect if we committed the kinds of misconduct, frankly, that some police have committed in the United States in recent years.
Right.
There is a sort of immunity from the kinds of punishment that we would expect. So by design, yes, they are in essence above the law.
Right.
The other respect in which you might ask whether they're above the law is practice. And empirically, we actually know that police are, for example, less likely to be convicted of the same kinds of allegations, right, that you or I would be convicted of, right? That includes things like murder or assault or what have you. And partly that is by design, right, because they're doing it in the context of their jobs. They are afforded a little bit more latitude. But there may be some other factors at play there.
Okay.
And so I would suggest that that question is, while an important one that lots of people ask, may be different from the one we ought to be asking right now.
And what is that we ought to be asking?
I would say the question we ought to be asking, or the questions that we ought to be asking, are to what extent are they above the law, right? Especially in the wake of this Tyree Nichols incident. And second, who, or rather which police are above the law? Because what the Tyree Nichols case presents for us is a different set of circumstances. I won't say distinct, but a different set of circumstances than those that have defined what I would consider the paradigmatic case of police-community relations, where now you've got black officers with a black victim in a unit that's led by a black official.
Right.
And I think that's different. And so people are rightly asking, will black police officers be convicted for the kinds of crimes that police have been committing for years?
Right.
Will, in the face of a black leader, right, we expect the same kind of outcomes, a black police chief in particular, that we've seen in other cases historically, with some rare recent exceptions. And so I think the question is, are they above the law when there is video evidence? Are they above the law when they are black? Are they above the law when the leadership is black? This case introduces some slightly different, I think, nuances that might make us want to ask that question a little bit differently.
And speaking of this specific case, I just want us to sit with like the gruesome and violent way in which this particular case of police violence took place. And then to follow up on your question of to what extent and rather whom is held accountable. When in the case of Tyree Nichols, when it was 5 black police officers that were terminated, arrested, and charged right away. And this is a testament now to me, at least, that it is possible to condemn police brutality right when it happens. I think it took like 20 days or less. And it is possible to take swift action towards justice. Whereas we can go down the list. Laquan McDonald in Chicago, Alter Sterling, Eric Garner, Pamela Turner, Sandra Bland, Philando Castillo, Mike Brown. The names are endless. And so we did not see that kind of swift response.
Mhm.
And so you are right that it is important to ask the question, whom and to which race do they belong when we
Mhm.
talk about, police accountability. So
Mhm.
I would like for you to elaborate further on your thoughts as to who is held accountable and whether or not they'll be convicted of the crimes that they're accused of.
Yeah. I think there are two questions at play here. And one is this simply a sign of the times? Meaning that as history has marched forward, right, the arc of history is bending toward justice more and more in cases like this, where it's maybe inevitable that the more these kinds of cases surface, the swifter the action will be, regardless of who's in leadership, regardless of who the perpetrators are, regardless of who the victims are. Or are we in a situation where, because the officers are black,
Right.
or because the leader is black, they're acting differently than their white counterparts in prior times? That I don't know the answer to, and we don't have enough data for that. And frankly, I hope we never get enough data to truly answer that question the way as somebody who's a social scientist would want. But that's what I think this latest instance is presenting us with. It's making us question what factors are truly at play here. And ultimately, will we be satisfied with whatever happens here? Are we going to be satisfied if the black officers are convicted swiftly when they commit a crime against a black individual? Will we be satisfied if it takes a black leader to come in and enact swift justice for the abuse or mistreatment of a black victim? Or will it not matter, right? Will we simply be able to say that this is just an artifact of where the police, where our society are moving as a whole, such that we can expect swift and appropriately severe responses whenever there's misconduct? And frankly, the only way for us to really know that is for there to be another incident with a different set of characters, and we maybe start to compare, or for that matter, lots of them. But as I said, the hope is that we don't end up with
In that
a
situation.
circumstance where, yeah, we need to develop a larger sample size, if you will,
Right.
for us to really be sure what's driving things here.
Okay. And then you mentioned the word reform, but you also
Mhm.
mentioned the word race. And so if you look at, there's a lot of news outlets that are profiting off, like, arguing that there is no racial issue in policing because
Mhm.
in this particular case, it was black officers
Mhm.
violating and killing a black person.
Mhm.
And so rather than the usual day-to-day incidents that we see of white officers brutalizing black bodies.
Mhm.
And so how do you respond to people making the arguments that there is no racial bias issue in policing
Mhm.
because this too can happen in the way that it did in the Tyre Nichols
Yeah,
case?
that's a great question. I think there are two ways to answer that. One is that there may be bias, but not in the way that we've historically characterized it. So what we do see consistently, or disproportionately, I should say, is black victims of police brutality. What does not appear to have changed is that there are not white women or white men showing up and being mistreated and abused by police officers. I mean, think about the many cases of what I'll call domestic terrorism, where someone was brought without incident, right, to a police headquarters, underwent a normal, traditional trial without incident, and is still walking around the country, as in theory should happen in a justice system that works the way it should in a democratic society. We let the circumstances play out. But that has far too seldom not been the case for black people, for black men, women, and trans folks. And so I think there is one way in which we could say there is racial bias, but the bias exists in terms of the victim, right, and not necessarily in terms of the perpetrator. And maybe that's what the Tyre Nichols incident is teaching us. And not just Tyre Nichols, by the way, because there have been other incidents.
Right.
There was a case of a young man in Virginia, Marcus David Peters, who was killed by a police officer during a mental health crisis. And full disclosure, I happen to be related to him. But that sparked a change in laws in Virginia around when police would respond to incidents of mental health crisis. But in that case, as in this one, the victim was black, the officer involved was black, and much of the leadership of the city, including the mayor of, at the time, Richmond, Virginia, was also black, right? And that suggests to you that the people in power may change, but the relatively disempowered are not changing very much. And if the relatively disempowered are still held constant, if you will, and subject to this kind of consequence, that itself is a form of bias, that, and racial bias in particular, that I think is worth noting, even if the people who are in power manage to vary their appearance, their look, what have you. So I think there is a way in which you can say there is racial bias anyway. On the other hand, I think what perhaps incidents like Marcus David Peters' murder and the murder of Tyree Nichols, and I'm going to use that term, might demonstrate to us is that who is in power is perhaps less important. And if anything, these incidents reveal to us that the nature of a system, right, or of systemic racism in particular, is that it doesn't matter who actually is at the control of the system, right? The system functions as it should, right? If you are driving a Honda, the Honda's going to drive the way the Honda drives, whether I'm driving it, you're driving it, a woman is driving it, or whomever, right? Because that is what a car does. It's not going to start flying because someone else is behind the wheel tomorrow.
Right.
And maybe that is the nature of policing, in that there is something about the system, and I think this is the argument that people make when they say that there's systemic racism, that there's something about the system that manages to co-opt the individual attributes, behaviors, inclinations, predispositions of the people who occupy that system.
So it's not a case of bad apples, rather it's a case of the system itself is causing people to behave in a certain way.
Quite possibly, exactly.
And then I just want to take a second to acknowledge the fact that you just told us that you yourself is related to someone that was murdered by the police. And so I wanted to pivot to that and discuss the trauma that black people experience through watching themselves on camera over and over again, being brutalized, humiliated, murdered, and in instances, even being directly related to them, because this is something that I did not know about you. And so how do we deal with that? Like the idea that if these videos did not exist, America probably would not care. But because the videos do exist, it creates a new form of trauma and a new form of normalization of being okay with seeing black bodies dehumanized again and again and again. And then we have the same conversations like we're having now. Because if history has taught us everything, this probably will not be the last time that we talk about this.
Yeah.
Which is disheartening to say.
It is.
But then again, if we don't talk about it, there is no movement towards change.
Right.
Accountability and justice. So for you, how do you deal with and compartmentalize having to be related to someone and experiencing that trauma? Now, coming at an institution like this and teaching students about it, and for majority of them, it's just an academic topic,
Right.
something that they're discussing in a classroom.
Right.
There's no human experience behind it, you know. Or for some, it is just another argument or something to talk about.
Right.
Whereas you stand there, you teach them about it, you have discussions, but it's a family issue for you. You know, it's yourself.
Yeah, I would say there are two things for me, and I'll say as well that while I was related to Marcus David, I didn't know him very well. He was much younger than I am, and so in some ways I have a distant connection to it. It is important to me that this is somebody that I was connected to, that it affirms that it could be any one of us, right? As President Obama said many years ago, there before the grace of God go I, right? That could have been me, but I think we should be thinking about that with every person who's murdered, whether they're related to me or not. I should be thinking about that with Breonna Taylor, with George Floyd, et cetera, et cetera. But I think one of the things I have purposely tried not to do with myself is develop the kind of courage or resilience to repeatedly watch us, people of color, being subjected to this treatment. I have not to this day watched the full Tyree Nichols video. I have not to this day watched the full George Floyd video, because I think that there is a way in which exposing myself to that, and each of us exposing ourselves to that and repeatedly doing that, degrades each of us. right? It should always be shocking and traumatic when it happens. It shouldn't happen at all. And it is helpful that it is being recorded insofar as it, and I'm saying helpful in quotation marks here because it's certainly not desirable from anyone's perspective. But the fact that these things are being caught on camera, that this miscarriage of justice is being televised, allows us to perhaps have an opportunity to remedy things in a way that we couldn't with the way our system worked before in the absence of that technology. But I also think it is dangerous for us to develop sort of an appetite for being able to watch people die before our eyes, for being able to watch, and I think that's true regardless of who it is, but to be able to watch black men die, it might normalize that kind of thing. This is just what happens. This is just the circumstance of this. And I think in some ways, each time we watch it, perhaps as miserable or as outraged as it makes us, it also makes us a little bit more comfortable.
With it.
And I don't think we should ever be comfortable with it. And I don't ever want to be comfortable with it. But for me, I don't need to watch it to be uncomfortable with it. The abstract idea
of it alone,
the concept of it is enough for me that I don't want to watch the video. And, somebody has to, right? As part of our justice system, somebody will likely be exposed to that video. They'll watch it through and through, and they'll make a decision. But if you simply describe to me in words
what happened, that's enough.
What happened to Tyree Nichols, I would say,
I've seen enough of this in the past to know that.
Not even seeing enough of it in the past. Those details, the sequence of events, the number of commands that were shouted at the person, the number of wounds that were inflicted, the kinds of wounds that were inflicted, all of those to me tell enough of a story without me having to go and stand right there and observe it and possibly do harm to myself. And so for me, to answer your question, what I do is I let myself sit with the idea without having to experience the actual event in and of itself.
And you're a policy professor, so I thank you for your response, by the way. I want to pivot a little bit to talk about, you mentioned the word reform. Reform happens through policy. And so there are a lot of scholars who are abolitionists, whereas others are reformists. And so what is your take on the abolitionist movement of it is time to abolish the system of policing as we know it because data empirically has shown over and over again that there's something wrong with the system. There's something not working. There are other scholars like Derek Bell who talks about interesting verges or interest conversion where racial change particularly takes place when the power structures and the people within the movement have something in common. And so if the only time racial change can occur is for us to have something in common with systems and structures that don't value us, how do we live with that knowledge, if that is in fact how things work?
Yeah, so I like Bell's theory. I think it applies a lot when you think about something like school desegregation, which was, if I recall correctly, the context in which he originally propounded that idea. This is not like school desegregation, but it's not entirely like school desegregation in the sense that, yes, policy change happens when you can get interests, otherwise divergent or competing interests, to find common ground. I think that is a reasonable take on how at least some policy change happens. I think it is, first of all, is in the collective interest of our society, the United States at large, to remedy this kind of injustice or this kind of miscarriage of justice. Not least because it flouts the basic principles of the criminal justice system, right? If the system is not fair, then it's going to be problematic no matter what. If it's not fair for you, it's not fair for me, it's not fair. It has to be fair to everyone to be fair at all.
And it's not like only black people are dying at the hands of police.
Exactly.
White people are too, and other races as well.
Exactly.
And so it's an issue for everyone. It's just that the manner in which it happens to black people happens to be extremely violent.
Yeah.
and disturbing. But
Right, and that
sorry.
shouldn't happen to anyone, regardless of their race, their gender, their sexual orientation. We know there are disparities. There shouldn't be disparities, but in an absolute sense, there also shouldn't be certain kinds of outcomes. Right, there should be some things that we say just are not acceptable in our society. Period, and they include arbitrary abuse of power, right, or arbitrary application of the law, that kind of thing. So I think that there is a way in which it is in everyone's collective interest to get it right when it comes to how policing is done. And it is clear that we have gotten it wrong in far too many cases. I don't know what number is enough cases, but we've gotten it far too wrong in far too many cases. Now, on the question of reform versus abolition, I'm not convinced that those are fundamentally different things, right? I think when I hear people saying they want to abolish the police, what I hear is that second part that you mentioned, as we know it, right? Which is to say, the way that we've chosen to design and implement policing in the United States is not the way policing must exist. And we know that's not the way it must exist because it's not the way it exists everywhere in the world, right? There are police officers in Western countries where everyone is not carrying around a gun, let alone military-style assault weaponry, right? Where they're not equipped with tanks, right? Where they're not getting more funding than schools or other kinds of
Or
officials,
the
right?
GDP of an entire country.
Right. And so we can, when I hear people saying abolish the police, what I think I hear them saying is actually something more akin to reform. I think you hear a lot of people saying, we want police. We want police. However, we want responsible police. We want police that are respectful. We want police that are accountable. We want police that actually safeguard people. We want police that are effective at reducing murder. We want police that are effective at reducing crime. We want police that are not complicit in drug crime and gun crime and the kinds of things that we've heard about in places like Baltimore. That's what people want. And in theory, you can have a police force like that because those kinds of police forces exist.
Around the world.
We've chosen as a polity in many cases not to design or operate our police in that way, and that is a choice we do not have to make. So when people are saying they want to abolish police, I think they're saying they want to abolish the manifestation that has become in some ways quintessentially American,
Right.
and does not need to exist that way. And there are some indicators that that kind of policing can be done away with and can redound to the benefit of the community, right? So I think about Camden and its initiative to reform the police and change the way that they worked fundamentally. There are other cities and localities experimenting with not necessarily changing or getting rid of a police force, but changing the things that they respond to. And that statute that was passed in Virginia as a result of Marcus David Peters' murder is one example of that, right? So police are being called to deal with mental health crises. They're not mental health professionals, right? They're being called to deal with schoolyard fights. They're not teachers. They're being called to deal with all manner of things that fall outside of what historically or spatially, when we look around the world, are not ordinary policing functions and don't need to be policing functions, right? Because we have other professionals in our society that are better suited to handle those things than police are. And I think if we allow for the possibility that those other people do their job well, then we won't be getting rid of police. We will be optimizing police to do what they are perhaps distinctly, uniquely capable of doing for societies, right? Which is protecting people and ensuring compliance with, appropriate, legitimate laws.
We don't have much time left, so I want to make sure I drop this. We're both from the Bronx, so it's like, I want to shout out the Bronx real quick.
Yes.
So there is that, but also growing up in the South Bronx, the sort of violence with policing that we've been seeing across the country, it's not foreign to youth growing up in the hood.
No.
All across the United States. If anything, it's like a part of daily life. You go to a party and you're coming back and there's police around, you expect to be harassed. Like, growing up, I can count a number of instances where me and my friends had like poor interactions with the police. So then, that being said, how do we improve police-community relations? Because that is something you teach. And then I want to give you the last 2 minutes to offer your thoughts on race and policing and send us away with some wisdom.
So let me say before we depart, yes, shout out to the Bronx. It's a great teacher and a great environment to learn about precisely these kinds of issues, for better or for worse. I think it's also worth noting that notwithstanding my own personal experience, I want to give homage to the folks who are doing this kind of work and scholarship regularly. They include folks at Brown like Professor Gonzalez Van Cleve. They include Michelle Alexander, right? They include Elizabeth Hinton, who are exploring these issues within the criminal justice system far more astutely and with far greater erudition than I think I have in my career thus far. So I really want to acknowledge those people that are doing all of that fantastic
Thank
work
you.
and encourage folks who haven't read the work of those scholars to go ahead and do that, because that's a lot of what is informing my dialogue right now. I will also say that I think it's true that there are lots of cases, and I can certainly point to a number in my own life where I've witnessed police firsthand engaging in what I would consider misconduct or discrimination, right? I think about my time when I was in Carroll County, Maryland. I think about my time as a student at Boston University and the incidents I encountered there. But believe it or not, I can also point to a number of cases where I found responsible, dedicated, high-quality police officers.
Which is widespread as well.
Which is widespread as well. And I think there are models of how to do good policing out there, and there are people individually who are doing great policing. And I've been at Brown where I saw great examples of the kind of policing that I think is possible in a society where police function well. I was in New York City, believe it or not, the first internship I ever did, first or second, I forget, was in the NYPD's headquarters. And this is, I'll drop another little bit of insight from my life. So I'm a child of an incarcerated parent. So I grew up, aside from having an incarcerated parent, having grown up in the South Bronx, having had those encounters, with a certain set of perceptions around policing. NYPD. Right. That they had done a good job earning in their time. But I'll tell you, I encountered some really dedicated, really savvy police officers in a unit within the NYPD called the Community Affairs Unit. And that unit's role, in part, was to help foster positive community police relations. Right. And I encountered individual officers. In fact, I was looking up one in preparation for this who's still employed there, has gotten promoted, was a fantastic role model, black police officer, a fantastic role model. I have family members who are police members or former police members. I have a neighbor and folks that I've grown up with that became police officers. So I know that there are people out there who are doing the right thing and who are part of those communities. I can think back to times when I've been in Baltimore where I saw police doing good things. I remember a police officer was with a man who had looked like he had been pulled over. From my perception, that was my gut reaction, and I went over to really make sure that he wasn't going to be harassed. And Baltimore was a majority black city. This was a black motorist, and it was a black police officer. Come to find out, the police officer was trying to direct traffic to help him get off the road on the shoulder because his car had broken down. And I ended up working with them. We worked together to help get this car off, push this car off the side of a very busy street. He didn't have to do that. And I've seen those instances where officers have not only behaved responsibly, but above and beyond, what is required, and in a way that ultimately is very human, right? It's a way that we would like to see all of our police officers behave. And we'd like to see them behave that way regardless of the state they're in or the city they're in or their race. We'd like to see them behave that way regardless of their rank. And so I think there are models out there, and I think one of the things that we could do for police is elevate those folks that have always been doing the right thing. Right. And make sure that we highlight those instances where policing is going well, where we we tether our evaluations, if you will, to those people who are doing the right thing, and we hold them up as models of exactly what to do in when they encounter people. And the reality is, policing is a difficult job, and there are good reasons to have police. We do have crime in this country. We have mass shootings in this country. We need police for that. Right. And police serve an important function in any society, but there is a way to do it. There are ways to do it, I should say, that are perhaps better and certainly different from the way that we've seen it manifest in too many cases, including, again, that Tyree Nichols case. So I think the thing I want to leave with is, the nuance of this case. The Tyree Nichols case is introducing a new nuance, perhaps, in the sense that there are different players, or the players look a little different than they have historically, but the outcome is the same. But I think there have always been these cases where police have been doing the right things across the board. And I think if each of us searches hard enough, we can probably find those cases where that is true. What I think we have to do as a society, and what I think departments and departmental leaders and elected officials need to do, is find those cases, highlight those cases, elevate those cases, and really make sure that the model is following those cases and not the other way around.
Right.
I remember when I was a grad student hearing about research from a student who said essentially that if you, in any sort of organization, but they happen to be using police if I recall correctly, the quote unquote bad apples, the folks who misbehave, who break the rules, who do the thing that's negative or antisocial, those folks influence the good folks, not the other way around.
Right.
It'd be nice if the good folks could model behavior for the bad folks and they would turn around that way, but it turns out that it is quite the opposite. When you have an environment where misbehavior, misconduct, flouting of the rules is allowed to fester, it creates a tone that demotivates the people who are otherwise inclined or predisposed to doing the right thing. And then they become complicit. And maybe that's how you get a circumstance like Tyree Nichols. Because the system, right, co-opts everyone. That those negative attributes, those negative functions, those negative norms, they infect everyone, or almost everyone. And so I think part of what we need to do is root out the parts of the system that are the root of, that are causing the problem or exhibiting the problem in any case. And then make sure that the people we bring in to replace them, if that's what we choose to do, are going to be the people who embody the attributes of a well-functioning, accountable police force.
Dr. Blending, it's been great having you on Let's Just Talk, and I look forward to continuing these conversations with you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.